What about centrifugal forces inside Iran? I mean, it's clear that there has been a lot of discontent within Iran. The society is not just this simple, obedient, theocratic state. There is resistance to Khomeini and to the regime. Iran could collapse more quickly than Israel, surely.
There's no question that there's centrifugal forces in play inside Iran. But the question I have for you is, okay, what do you suggest we do?
Well, maybe help it collapse, let it collapse.
And how do we do that?
Difficult question to answer.
I mean, the Israeli solution is to bomb Iran, a massive air offensive involving the United States and Israel against Iran. First of all, I think, if anything, that will cause a rally around the flag effect in Iran, and it will work in exactly in an opposite way from the one you're describing. But furthermore, when you get into the business of social engineering on the foreign policy front, Freddie, you invariably get yourself into huge trouble. You want to remember, we tried to do social engineering in Afghanistan. How well did that work out? We tried to do social engineering in Iraq. How well did that work out? We tried to do social engineering in Libya. How well did that work out? I could go on and on.
Vietnam.
I've learned that Vietnam, exactly. I cut my teeth on Vietnam. I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. And I learned in those years that you want to stay out of places like Vietnam. If you think you can go into countries like Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and do social engineering, you're going to get yourself into one well of a lot of trouble. And I would note to you, Freddie, the Soviets went into Afghanistan before we went in. And that did not work out very well. And the British were in Afghanistan before the Soviets, and that did not work out very well. And the French were in Vietnam before we were in there, and that did not work out very well. And oh, by the way, after we left Vietnam in 1975 and 1979, the Chinese invaded Vietnam, and they got their snouts whacked. You want to stay out of these countries. You don't want to get involved in social engineering. And you certainly don't want to get involved in social engineering at the end of a rifle barrel.
Well, that is something, again, going back to your point about Trump's instinct, that's something that the Trump administration appears to understand much more clearly than its predecessors.
Absolutely. I think that Trump's basic instincts on foreign policy, the issues that I know about and care about deeply, are correct. His instincts are correct. It's the execution where you run into big trouble. And execution is terribly important, Freddie, in large part because these are incredibly complicated problems. One of Trump's fundamental mistakes to start with this time around was that he thought that he could deal with the problems rather easily. If you listen to him talk about Ukraine, he thought that he could come in and he could shut down the Ukraine war in a day or two. Indeed, he was talking about shutting down the Ukraine war even before he moved into the White House. Anybody who's studied the Ukraine conflict and U.S.-Russia relations knows that shutting down this conflict and improving relations with the Russians is going to involve a Herculean effort. It's almost impossible to figure out how you can do this. Maybe you can do it, but it's going to be a very difficult task. But Trump was quite flippant in his views about how easy it would be. And he's now finding out it's not easy. And the same thing goes with Iran. And the same thing goes with the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the same thing goes with tariffs. These are really tricky issues. The reason that we rely on experts, and President Trump does not like experts. He prefers to rely on his instincts, as he said when he talked about how he makes tariff policy. He prefers to rely on instincts. You can't rely on instincts. You have to rely on experts because these are incredibly complicated issues. I mean, Trump is the ultimate decider, and there's no question about that. And that's the way it should be. But he should be listening to people who have studied these problems, and letting them help him figure out how to get out of these problems. But he has not done that.
You mentioned earlier about how one of the difficult things about foreign policy is that it's very hard to keep one's eye on the same ball when there are so many different balls moving around. And this is particularly hard for American presidents and White House administrations. One story that's sort of popped up, really, it's been rumbling for a very long time, but there was this terrible terrorist attack in India and has now triggered a potentially nuclear conflict that Western analysts often just sort of forget about because we're so focused on the Middle East and Ukraine more recently, and perhaps China and Taiwan. But if India and Pakistan go to war, that is a conflict that, does America have any way of trying to moderate that conflict?
You know, it's funny, Freddie, but I was at a conference at Yale on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday that was devoted to India. And right before the conference started, the terrorist attack in Kashmir took place. So I have been thinking, for obvious reasons, about the India-Pakistan conflict over the past few days. Just to buttress your point, what's very interesting, it's hard to find serious discussion of this conflict in the newspapers these days because there are all sorts of other issues like Ukraine, Iran, tariffs, and so forth and so on that dominate it. So this issue has been pushed off to the side in a very important way because not only President Trump, but all of us can only deal with so many issues at the same time. Now, this is a very dangerous situation. These are two nuclear armed countries that have a history of fighting wars. And in the past, the United States has intervened in crises between these two countries to go to great lengths to shut them down. Mainly what we've tried to do is make sure that the Indians didn't launch a major attack against Pakistan, which would then lead Pakistan maybe to use nuclear weapons. But you don't have the sense that the Trump administration is paying careful attention to this conflict or that President Trump will intervene in a major way to dampen down the tensions the way previous presidents have, because he's so busy on so many other fronts. So it could be the case, let's hope this is not the case, that this one could spin out of control and you could have a real war and nuclear weapons might even be used. Because you want to remember, Freddie, if you look at the conventional balance of power between Pakistan and India, it greatly favors the Indians. And we've always feared that a conflict that started off at the conventional level would escalate to the nuclear level because the Pakistanis would feel compelled to turn to nuclear weapons if they were losing conventionally, which we expected to happen. None of this is to say that in the past or even now, a war will happen and nuclear weapons will be used. But the fact is there is real potential for a real war and there is real potential for nuclear use. And in that kind of situation, you want President Trump, you want the United States to be deeply involved in trying to settle this short of a shooting match. But I don't have the sense that that's what we're doing. Maybe we are, and I'm just not reading about it. Let's hope that's the case. But this is just another example of another ball in the air.
Well, I wonder if you were pretty down on tariffs earlier, but I wonder if this is an area where tariffs can give America substantial negotiating leverage. J.D. Vance visited India last week. Yet last night, Trump suggested that a free trade deal was on the horizon. I don't know whether the situation in Kashmir has been part of those discussions. I don't think anybody has said so publicly. But surely America could say, you might want to hold off retaliating, or you might want to do what we want in this conflict, or this free trade deal that we are now in the process of agreeing will be out the window.
I don't think we would do that. I think relations between the Trump administration and the Modi administration are very good, and we're not likely to play hardball with Modi in the way you just described. Um, but maybe that's the case. I do agree with your general point that although I think that tariffs, the way they were implemented, made no sense. I do think that the possibility of walking back the tariffs does give us leverage over allies and adversaries alike. So I think that we do have some leverage there. Maybe Trump could tell the Indians that he'd give them a real sweetheart deal if he felt they were on the verge of going to war and Trump didn't want them to go to war. But it's just hard to say what's going on with regard to U.S. Indian relations over the Kashmir crisis at this point in time.
You've touched on China a couple of times. It seems to me, looking at almost everything the Trump administration does, whether it's the war on DEI in Harvard, and that actually involves fighting back against a lot of Chinese influence in American higher education institutions, or whether it's the Panama Canal, the Gulf of America, as it's now called, or whether it's Greenland, or whether it's even Iran and the Middle East, and Ukraine too, and of course Taiwan. China is increasingly the main strategic focus, and the Trump administration, all the sound and fury that it makes on the world stage, there's always a Chinese element in its thinking.
There's no question about that. You want to remember what I said about Trump's first administration, right? Only radical change that was made in foreign policy or domestic policy was with regard to our approach to China. Up until 2017, when Trump moved into the White House, the United States had pursued a policy of engagement with China. This was true in Republican administrations, and it was true in Democratic administrations. Both the Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration played a key role in bringing China into the World Trade Organization, which helped China grow its economy by leaps and bounds. But when Trump came into office in 2017, he abandoned engagement and he did a 180-degree turn and adopted a policy of containment. So Trump has had his eye on China as a potential threat for a long time. And as I said, he also was interested in improving relations with the Russians in his first administration, because he wanted to have good relations with the Russians so that we could pivot to Asia and so that we could peel the Russians away from the Chinese, right? So from the get-go, Trump has been very oriented towards containing China. Biden, it's important to emphasize, Biden followed in Trump's footsteps. Biden did not go back to engagement. He stuck with containment. And in fact, you could argue that Biden was tougher on containment vis-a-vis China than Trump was in the first administration. Now, Trump is back to dealing with China. He wants to focus on China. This is what we were talking about when we focused on Pete Hegseth before. Hegseth is a China hawk. He wants to contain China. There's just no question about that. And you want to understand what's happened here, Freddie, is that since 2017, when Trump first moved into the White House, the balance of power between China and the United States has shifted in China's favor. We meaning the United States, is still the most powerful state on the planet. China is clearly number two, but China is closing the gap. And the United States lives in mortal fear that the Chinese are going to dominate cutting edge technologies moving forward. We have a competition with the Chinese as to who's going to develop sophisticated technologies moving forward. And the great fear in the United States is that the Chinese are going to beat us at that game. And that's going to have huge economic consequences. And furthermore, as the Chinese economy grows, and closes the gap between its size and the size of the American economy, it takes that economic wherewithal and translates it into military might. So the Chinese military is growing more and more powerful with the passage of time. The Chinese are not only building military forces that will be useful in East Asia, they're also developing power projection capability. They're building a blue water navy. They want a military that can go along with their Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese are imitating the United States, and this really spooks the Americans, and the Americans want to contain China. Again, as I said, this was true of the Biden administration, and it is certainly true of the Trump administration. But what you want to understand is that because we're pinned down in the Middle East and we're pinned down in Ukraine, it's very difficult for us to pivot to Asia. The best example of this, and it's a very important example, is our war against the Houthis, right? The United States has huge numbers of naval assets deployed in and around the Red Sea for purposes of fighting against the Houthis. What's happening is we are expending huge amounts of ammunition against the Houthis that is needed for East Asia. We have large numbers of naval forces in the Middle East that should be in East Asia. It just shows you the difficulty we're having pivoting to Asia to deal with China. And this is all at the same time that China is growing more powerful militarily. And again, this gets back to the Iran scenario. Do we really want to launch a major war against Iran that will go on for a long period of time, that will necessitate keeping large numbers of American forces in the Middle East for a long period of time, when we have to be principally concerned with East Asia and containing China? And of course, the answer to that is no.
I think what you in relation to China, I think what you're talking about there is what people in your world call the Thucydides trap, which I believe was Allison's term, was it originally? That two superpowers cannot really exist together, or at least one superpower cannot replace another superpower without there being a major war. Do you think that trap has inevitably been sprung, is springing? Is a major conflict between China and America inevitable?
Let me tell you what my basic argument here is. The Thucydides trap is an argument that Graham Allison laid out, which is different than mine. My argument is that any great power in an ideal world wants to dominate its region. It wants to be a regional hegemon. It wants to be by far the most powerful in its region of the world. And it also wants to make sure that it does not have a peer regional hegemon. The United States is the only regional hegemon in modern history. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. There is no threat to the United States from any other country, military threat, from any other country in the Western Hemisphere. We are a regional hegemon. At the same time, we go to great lengths to make sure that there is no other regional hegemon either in Europe or in East Asia. Therefore, we went to great lengths to help defeat Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and the Soviet Union. We played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history because the United States does not tolerate peer regional hegemons. The problem that we face with China is because it's so powerful, it threatens to dominate all of Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. And that is unacceptable to the United States. And this largely explains why President Trump, when he moved into the White House in January 2017, abandoned engagement and pursued containment policy. And it's why Joe Biden doubled down on Trump's containment policy, because both of them understood that China cannot be allowed to become a regional hegemon. Now, one final point. It does not mean that war is inevitable. With regard to Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, and Nazi Germany, obviously there were wars, world wars, and the United States got involved to prevent those countries from becoming regional hegemons. But if you think back to the Cold War, which you and I know well, in the Cold War, thankfully, we did not have a hot war. It was a Cold War. And the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, and then the Soviet Union disintegrated in December 1991. But it was without a shooting war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Let's hope that the security competition that has now set in, where the United States is trying to prevent China from dominating Asia, ends up like the Cold War and not like World War I and World War II. It's very important, especially since we live in the nuclear age, that we not have a war between China and the United States. But the potential, Freddie, for a war is real because China has a deep-seated interest in dominating Asia. It's in China's interest. And we have a deep-seated interest in preventing China from dominating Asia.